Hello, everyone out there in open space world, and good now to you wherever and whenever you are. My name is Ryan Erickson. I am a board member of the Open Space Institute US, and I am happy to welcome you here to the fifth episode, I believe, of the Open Space Living Room video exploration and podcast. I am here with my fellow board member of the Open Space Institute of the US, Harold Shinsato, and an esteemed guest of renown, Paul Levy, who we will explore his wanderings into open space today. As usual and typical for our platform here, we start with a standard question. And Harold, I will toss it over to you for our beginning.
Thank you, Ryan. Paul, I've known you for quite a few years now, and I'm very grateful to have you here as someone who's, I believe, an innovator in open space with your idea of Popup Open Space, and also the books you've written, including the Digital Inferno, but there are others, and also your work with theater. And I believe there's probably more that you could share other than your work in the Fringe Festival, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, Fringe.
Yeah, Brighton, Edinburgh, and Melbourne.
Right. And so what we ask our guests the first time is, since this is really an open space technology, open space philosophy podcast, if you will, is what brought you into this open space universe? Tell us what got you here.
It's a classic origin story. Yeah, it's a classic origin story, Harold, that almost parallels the origin story of open space through Harrison Owen. There's me beginning my life having graduated as a research assistant in the field of organizational change and innovation, and finding myself even in the early days either on the receiving end or even being asked to present bullet point after bullet point, even in those early late 80s days of PowerPoint. PowerPoint was new, but what happened was when you opened PowerPoint, it always offered you a slide, and that slide was one bullet point, and it was so easy just to then write text. And down the slide went bullet points. And I would sit, sometimes it was 2 or 3 days of a research conference, sitting on the receiving end of content delivered from a lectern, perhaps with time for some questions, perhaps with time for the occasional breakout. And I can remember even those very first ones, even when my presentation went well, we would always go afterwards, yeah, the best things were the lunch breaks, the best things were the breaks, the pop-up conversations. And to be honest, in most cases, I was bored, sitting there very still, wondering what conversation wasn't able to happen because the structure of the system was getting in place of what was trying to emerge and show itself in the form of fresh thinking, fresh dialogue. And that happened at lunch. That happened when people hung on afterwards, though when these conferences dominated, people usually left early rather than hung on for those conversations. They tended to hang on beyond the life of a session, even if there was another session happening, because that session had been a conversation. At that session, the speaker was responsive, was saying, what should we talk about? Not what I'm here to tell you something. And so I guess I discovered by, I'm going to call it grace, it was an invitation to a conference that apparently was using a different model called Open Space Technology. And it was a conference on the future of management education in the UK. It was sponsored by a journal, so the write-up was going to be a dedicated journal, book of proceedings. And I went along. It was a beautiful place in the countryside. It was facilitated by a guy called Jack Martin Leith, who rather expertly and very minimally, I would say, it probably took an hour for a 5-day conference. It took an hour for that group of people not to be spoken at and spoken to and controlled, but to organize our own journey, our own conversation. And it was so simple. I can remember even at the end of the first day asking, this is so obvious. Do we not do it because it's under our noses, or are there other reasons? But we created the agenda. and with just a few little principles that describe what happens when you allow people to self-organize, I found myself naughtily, as it felt at that time, leaving a session to just go sit in the bar and have a spontaneous conversation, and didn't realize that I'd been a bumblebee or a butterfly, as I just sat there looking beautiful, and someone came and sat with me, and we had a really interesting conversation that wasn't planned. And some of the sessions had people arriving and leaving, and they were all the principles we could talk about here. But essentially, for the first time, this was actually a 5-day conference where the agenda was created, was self-organized, and then the proceedings truly proceeded from that conversation. And I've used that joke ever since, that in open space, as I discovered it was called, there's a true set of proceedings, that what is written up is a report of what happened, rather than what were often called proceedings were really precedings. They'd already been written and sent in before the event. I've been left now, all those years later, still loving a good lecture. A good lecture needs to be brilliant. I can sit and be inspired for an hour and choose not to use my 2 feet and realize I didn't leave, which still fits in with this notion of we should be able to self-organize where we put our feet. So I still occasionally will go to a conference and not say, why aren't we all talking? Because I want to listen to that person. But interestingly, it's a lot rarer than it was in those days, Harold.
We're in quite an epoch right now. There's epical things happening with what's happening in the Gaza and in Israel and the Mediterranean and so many places. I'm curious about the settings, the year when this introduction happened. Just to orient ourselves.
Well, I pondered that for so many years, and it came up again in my head when I was invited for this conversation. I believe that in the process of humanity and reality evolving, 2 things often happen, and I don't know whether they happen intentionally, but what happens is, in the case of the descent of self, the fact that human beings once lived much more intuitively with nature and worshipped the sun, and then we codify into language as we develop, and then we start to develop hierarchies of control. And instead of that direct oneness with the universe, we now have high priests who kind of tell us what to do, and that becomes the hierarchies of education, of commerce, the hierarchies of armies with top down and people following. There seems to come a moment, and people put that date very differently. Some people always quote Descartes with, I think, therefore I am. You know, the separation of suddenly I want to know who I am. And to do that, I need to stand outside myself, and I see myself as an individual, and I call myself a self. And the word I starts to appear in literature, in stories, much, much more. And we stand alone in the world. But at the same time, that gives us the gift of asking, who am I? And what am I doing here? And we couldn't ask that when we're in that kind of group tribal consciousness. And there's a bizarre thing that we yearn for that too. We still yearn for that connection, to bring the individual back into the community. And writers that I really rate, like Rudolf Steiner, say it's no longer an either or. We can go back into union and community and oneness without losing that individuality. And so before that open space moment in the 80s, literally it was around the 80s, I think that open space kind of escaped as well. There was a whole path that, for myself as a social scientist, I could map the literature of where the conference started to have breakout groups, where the breakout groups started to be a bit more self-organized, where schools, instead of just having the teacher at the front, started to do group work, where tea groups in industry were starting to talk about teamwork, where unconferences started to be kind of a phrase that was coined. But all of them were still, to most extent, still rooted in quite a lot of structure to hold the unstructure. And then it seems a moment came, and I say it came to me when I went to this invite, that I was catapulted to the impossible, where the question seemed to be, how do we disappear as facilitators? How can structure minimize to become the absolute minimum that natural law needs for self-organization and emergence to come from a collection of selves who are passionate about something? The beautiful thing about open space for me is it's self-organization on two levels. One is the union of everybody self-organizes their agenda. But the other one is all those little separate selves make the free decision to take their self in and out of that conversation. And so it's always meant both for me. And I love the fact, I don't know what's going on so much in the US, but I remember the name Reagan. This happened for me as we started to question Thatcherism and that famous, slightly misquoted quote, "There's no such thing as society, only individuals." For me, open space technology resolved that unfair binary paradox as either we're alone or we're together. And if we're together, we disappear as the drop into the ocean with no self. For me, it was the union of those two things, which is I make my free individual choice in every moment. I'm self-organizing an open space.
There's a lot of threads we could follow here.
In hour 4, we forward in time to that. I think one thing I heard there that was very interesting in terms of the appearance of the word I, in literature in general. And just to imagine there was a time when that wasn't happening, and that now the separation happens, and then this idea of loss of collective and then loss of just this group identity. But what came to me is that now now we can see ourselves, but what is it to be, what that yearning to be in a group is to be seen by others, right? To be seen and understood. And that dance between I know who I am and how am I being, and how am I being with you, and how does my being with you impact us, and what do we feel together, and how do we become a we and not just a me. That dance sounds like that's something that's been happening, and I think is continuing to evolve, especially now that the we has a lot more it in it. I think, as Harold, I think you started to say about being involved in that technological frame, but
Well, I guess I would just add to that for me, that it now, the rise of a very specific form of materialistic science, that, an AI, which will say it's only a matter of time before we resolve the soul, the spirit, whatever we call it, into an it, that can be, turned into a computer and uploaded and stuff like that, isn't something I particularly buy. But I guess also just I think the bit I think I forgot to answer was about the convergence of this was all happening. And then Harold's question about, did it happen at a particular time, maybe for a reason? Is it also suddenly became manifested through one individual, and so eloquently in what people new to open space might call the guidebook, some of the other books that came along. But often when something is happening that represents some sort of, quantum change, some important change, some big step of evolution, it also escapes through somebody who articulates it. And I believe that so I'm saying open space evolved in the world, and it also popped into Harrison Owen's head, who articulated it. And it doesn't really matter who one credits for it, but it's come at a time that's made things extremely inconvenient for us. And I love that inconvenience. It's still going on. That when I say I am with you, Ryan, you have two things at the same time. One is the sense of a we there, and the other one is there's I am, and there's with you. There's a separation. And at open space conferences and events, I invite people to go to them. You will see that tension playing out in all kinds of ways, because freedom is a big responsibility, and we're all learning how to do it. And so one thing open spaces aren't usually are big love-ins. They sometimes find that convergence, and you might see the circle is one, but sometimes the circle is absolutely one circle of individuals, and you feel that phase in and out. I love that.
This balance between the self and the sphere, the foreground and the background, and you bringing Harrison Owen, kind of this single individual, that this idea of this dynamic process of the facilitator becoming more invisible. Since I am sad because I've visited Ann Stadler. She's just passed. Many say that Ann Stadler was kind of a co-creator of this phenomenon, and in many ways, Ann Stadler is probably going to remain largely invisible. But she brought in the big cameras. She was a television producer, kind of McLuhan, and the medium is the message in a way. And I remember when I heard her speak, her wisdom was profound at Leavenworth, which is when I met her first. Which Leavenworth is a resort town near Seattle, where Harrison Owen was promoting Wave Rider, and they did a big open space. It was a beautiful open space in the mountains. So my question here is, because you're a technosopher, this just seems really important for us to recognize how we all got here, and especially I'm curious about your particular journey through this. It's a really long, complicated question.
Well, my first stab at I'm going to interrupt myself. You might have just seen the light change, because I think this is a good background to what I'm about to say. So I'm in a seminar room at a modern building in the university, and what I have to now do is this. And the only reason that is because it's interesting that the so-called technology here makes the assumption that only if somebody is jumping around a room do the lights stay on. But if we're engaged in really intense spiritual activity, the lights go out because we're not doing anything. And I think that's very telling here. So I might have to wave them again unless I leap around. But so my first gig was, we were given a big grant to bring together academics and practitioners from all over the world to look at the future of technology, particularly in the manufacturing field. This was money from NATO at a time when there wasn't much war in the world. So NATO often is reminded, when the world isn't like it is now, that one of its main reasons for existing, I would say its main reason in its charter, is called peacekeeping. And so we got a big grant to look at the technologies of peacefulness and collaboration and all of that. Anyway, to cut the long story short, we're out in Slovenia, we're at Lake Bled, and there's the opportunity to create a conference with conference proceedings and invite loads and loads of presenters and blah, blah, blah. And instead we had open space. Now, I wasn't allowed to do open space for all the 3 days, but I got a good couple of days to do it. And so to cut the long story short, there as well, we had a publisher in place to publish the proceedings. We had people from about 20 or 30 different countries. The budget came in that it could fly people in. People flew more in those days, but pay their expenses. And they arrived and they had not been asked to submit any papers or proposals, which was great because some people didn't come. But it brought other people who did come, and we had a top statistical professor from Japan, and we had various people came. And I can honestly say it was a mixed bag in all the right ways, in that we still had people who under their arm had their lectures and their slides ready to present. And some of them had the rude awakening, that the beautiful description of what will happen if people are allowed to self-organize is that people will be mobile. They'll be freely mobile, and various people obviously, decided not to stay or go to those sessions because they were bored. We had breakout groups on gondolas going around the lake, on boats. We had the first laptops taking notes. Anyway, it was a beautiful open space, and it led to the book Technosophy, and we called it Technosophy, taking the metaphor, maybe the symbol of the goddess Sophia rather than logos and logic, to say that for us, technosophic design, and this was the conclusion of the book, and in those early days, I think they've come along, but you start to notice that the boards of directors that make things like the first iPhones had philosophers and artists in the design teams, not just engineers. That when you had, at least, to quote Rudolf Steiner, 12 points of view, different disciplinary points of view on a problem, you tended to get closer to the truth. And so we'd invited different disciplines in different countries, and they absolutely loved open space. And so for me now, when I look at the world that we're in, the troubled world, and why we're in trouble, I think it's because we're not being technosophic in the design. Because if we designed drones, for example, technosophically, there'd be enough philosophers and moralists and not just economists, but sociologists, all having in open space a beautiful conversation about what will happen if the drones have bombs attached to them. Is that good for humanity? Humanity would go very differently if we had more open space, because on the sheer law of statistics, if there's a beautiful invitation for people to freely come to a conversation in a circle around what they are passionate about, and if they then open space around it, you will tend to get different points of view. And so you will tend to get technosophic conversations. Unfortunately, most of the conference invitations I'm getting still as an academic are inviting certain types of people to have very controlled certain types of conversation that lead to very certain types of outcomes that are not technosophic. Not a long answer for anyone.
I feel like we need to also moderate the depth, unfortunately, of what we're doing, so that we don't end up taking 4 hours for this conversation. Ryan and I feel good about what we're doing, but I don't think we're Joe Rogans yet. We can do 4-hour conversations that I actually.
Soon we shall travel into that domain, I think.
But I'm wondering, Ryan, if you'll ask their second question.
Yes. So the second riff of our jam session here today is, as we do them, is about a specific experience. You know, that it sounds, so far you've kind of given us some specific experiences. So we're leading into that. What was, I'll go different on the question, Harold. What was your most surprising experience in open space?
So Harold mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation the word pop-up open space. And I think I learned pop-up, Ryan, most at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, which is a city that cannot hold the sheer number of people wanting to put shows on. So they have to create venues that only last a few months. And the genius that goes on as schoolrooms, university lecture halls, shops, telephone boxes and public laboratories turn into pop-up venues during the Edinburgh Fringe. There's a huge amount of creativity that goes there. The concept of pop-up is actually, I would say, fairly recent. The pop-up shop, the pop-up gig. You know, I grew up with the pop-up book, which was always a thing of wonder. But there's something literally about things coming into being off the flat, off the, you know, the bland 2 dimensions. And so, just as Harrison might talk about open space kind of escaping, and me hinting that open space in some ways was already coming into humanity, and people like Harrison were the unique antennas that picked it up first, and necessarily because we were all focused on other stuff and articulated it. And for me, that's what, you know, visionary is. You see what other people don't see. I'm in a cafe. I'm in Brighton. I'm young. I'm a bit of a bachelor and a bit kind of lonely. So for me, I'm wanting company. And I don't mean female company. I mean, I'm just a bit of a loner, kind of wondering if my whole life is going to be that. I'm always going to be that self. And so I'm a social guy, and I think, and I'm honest, some part of my socializing was not selfless. It was the wish to be in company where I felt more alive. So I would tend to be a cafe person. I would tend to join groups. I would tend to be part of theatre companies because I felt more myself in groups. And so I started to host a cafe conversation, which I knew about open space, where basically I would issue an invitation, which in those days before social media was quite hard to issue. In the early days, it would involve posters on walls and things like that. But the first one, I think I called it a wretchedly content cafe conversation. And it was to come and talk about whatever, but it was kind of aimed at creative facilitators in Brighton that I was part of that field. I was doing work in action learning, open space, that kind of stuff. So the invite kind of says, if no one comes, I'm doing what I usually do, having a great coffee in one of the best cafes in town. I'm on the sofa in the corner, but I like to talk and dialogue. Come join me. And that happened. And 2 people joined, and 4 people joined. And at one point, I think there were 35 people joined. The cafe owner was really happy because it was a quiet time during the cafe. And then it happened. I realized eyes were on me, particularly when the group was more than 5 or 6, going, who's controlling this thing? And I didn't. Only issued the invitation and spoke to whoever I want to. If I'm honest, I looked after a few of the lost sheep. I would try and facilitate them in if they were on the edges, but sometimes I just left them alone. And so what happened was our little table was too big when too small when people came. So a satellite table would happen, and they'd be having a conversation about something. And before you knew it, you could see that at 9 in the morning, everybody, even standing up, would be gathering around the circle and talk. And then I kind of just naturally said, so we've got 5 or 6 tables here. I'm normally here for about 10 or 11. You can stay as long as you like. But, if you've got something you want to invite anyone to come and talk about, then, why not? And somebody said, well, actually, I'm working on a new business idea. I'd love some input. I'll be sitting over here. And before we knew it, once or twice I wrote, sometimes it was just remembered, but it absolutely became open space. Once or twice in the invite, I would say what some of the open space principles were, sometimes not. But anyone filming that would see a fully kosher open space conference happening from start to finish, other than writing up, other than making a record. Although some people did. Some people would, thank everybody for coming to that, saying that here's a few notes that I took. But we never took it there. But I remember looking back at one of those and going, open space wants to happen. We get in the way.
This also comes in the theme of, I think we were at the last piece in high performance, was that how do we open space for 8 billion conversations, better conversations? And that it's not about bringing open space to places, because the space is already open. And I think it is just opening the space where you are. I think that's exactly what you did. And that's maybe a precursor to how those conversations might happen in the future.
But it's left me with 2 still unanswered questions. Harold, you know one of these because I've been asking it for a long time. And in some ways I've been seen as a bit of maybe a unnecessary voice, a critique, which is what happens when, take me in the cafe, if I really start working the room because I care about everybody and it's coming for the right reasons. But what happens if it gets over facilitated? What happens if, in order to get to the moment where we all head off, it's taken an hour for me to introduce it and do the historical lecture, and I've designed the walls and I've set up the tea and coffee station, and in the end, how does that serve the space in the way I've just told that story? And linked to that was picking up Harrison's kind of quote, always look for one less thing to do, which again is a very, very old proverb in so many religions, and particularly go back to the Far East, is what happens if the one less thing to do is facilitation. That I think there's an assumption with open space that one of the minimums is that you need somebody who walks the circle in a certain way and rings the bell and introduces it and tells the story of Harrison Owen. The pop-up, the self-pop-up, really shows that certainly in certain circumstances, facilitation itself is another control mechanisms that is unnecessary. Because open space wants to happen. It's part of an evolutionary step we're taking.
This comes back to the awareness of self and as well as community, and what do I do? Am I even needed am I needed with the facilitator hat on, I remember some really strong antipathy in some corners of the open space community to even use the word facilitation as what a person doing the inviting of open space as being. But that's the closest professional hat, if you will, that someone can take on and then maybe earn a living, which we all have to do. And since you're kind of an expert at technology and philosophy around it, I think this pop-up question is very relevant to how we engage and maybe encourage these surprising experiences while being aware that there's a tyranny of expertise that seems to be like subtly woven in to professionalism. The whole, all of what's happening in AI, and I don't know if you know Matthias Desmet's work, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, but there's the book I'm referencing is The Tyranny of Experts, that has really made me step back and think, because that is the expertise is what sells. And
Well, also, I think it's a mixed story, Harold, in that I think in my own biography, back into the 80s, I believe that Harrison, and at the time I remember not thinking he did, but I think he did the right thing in that he did a lot of training in open space, and he accepted, I think that legendary story, it was, he didn't call it open space technology, it was, he kind of asked, well, what do you want to call it? And it was in India, and somebody said, call it that. And so call it whatever you like. It's a very relaxed guy, very emergent guy. But I think he was right in that you wouldn't have had cafe pop-up open space in an organizational setting back in the 80s. The time has come more recently where that's been easier. It's a struggle. So he probably was right in that had people just been given open space, it would have disappeared again and it wouldn't have been ready. They would have tried to control it, and they wouldn't have got it, and they would always have put footnotes of control to it, and so on. So he wanted people to know this is how to do it. So it was a guidebook from a guide, not a boss. And a lot of people said that literally feels like their friend in the nice way of a guide. But of course, what happened is change takes a long time to happen. So it has become a bit of an industry. And I think one of the bits of feedback you'll often get from an open space rookie when they go to an open space run by the real pros is that they feel, I walked into a room where I think this was supposed to be simple, but they are dressing it up in a mastery that makes me feel alienated from it, makes me feel like a novice of which they are adepts. And I don't think Harrison ever intended that. I think he laughs at it and smiles at it and doesn't have a great problem with people want to train and learn. And certainly to be a good open space facilitator, you need to be a good facilitator, but actually you don't need to be a good open space facilitator. I think it's natural and it realizes itself in its own way. So ultimately, the more you professionalize it, the less like open space it becomes.
I think this may be a good time to launch into our final question that we typically ask, because we're already kind of addressing it. And it is, again, to you, Paul. What theme do you feel that at this moment ought to be brought into open space and explored that is not yet being explored?
That's a great question. And I think I'm answering it in a tentative way, but one that if you'd asked me this a few years ago, I think it would have been the same answer. And it was inspired by Phelim McDermott from Improbable Theatre and still continues to be, which is, I had heard of open space right in the grassroots of community that had people using open space to take action, to actually do things, not just talk about doing things. And I remember all the wonderful published work in the field of organization development that talked all about how do you get action happening in open space in a corporate organization setting. And so some people started to bolt on action planning at the end of the open space and sticky dots to prioritize actions. Others talked about when you have these sponsorship conversations, you don't agree to do an open space unless you've already got resources committed or permission from senior managers. They're not going to scupper it. So all the politics kind of wrapped around it and so on. And I believe that Phelim solved that, continues to solve it, has been the biggest influence in the arts in the UK, even in a world that's becoming more and more numb to this type of thing. It's very easy just to stay on social media and not take action. He goes around the country, his community goes around the country, inviting on a theme. And the theme is very generic because it's simply, what are we going to do about, and then insert whatever you like. But the invitation is an invitation to action, not an invitation to a conversation, but invitation to act. So absolutely at some of those open spaces, they do one every year about the world of theatre and the performing arts. What are we going to do about it? And there's lots of talking and hot air and people using their 2 feet. But organisations have been formed there. Funding has been given in the room before my eyes. And I've talked about 1 or 2 examples, and perhaps I wish I could see more, where we meet on a Monday morning in our park in a circle, and the aim is to make the park safer and cleaner. And somebody steps up and says, well, on Tuesday morning between 9 and 11, I'll be down by the river dredging on my own. Who wants to join me? And before you know it, by Friday, the park is safe and clean. So the theme for me, and when you look at what's going on about the need for peace and climate change, and in our case, a health service in crisis, and people all, even when they have no money, might still have their feet and their hands to do something. It's what are we going to do? It's invitations to action, not only conversation about possible action that I would love to see, because again, I think open space is the solution to so many of our problems, and we're not opening space much in the UK at the moment. And I think it might be because people are tired of talk. And we need to start inviting into action, into moving our feet, not just within the open space, but within the world at large. And I've got to do this now. There we go.
Do the wave.
You're like Kermit the Frog.
I'm hearing a question that actually I had never thought about, because when we brought up this theme question, it was we know that we have a small audience, Paul, that we're talking mostly to big open space technology fans, and when I'm hearing your question of like a really important theme for those of us that love open space as we've learned it through this community, through Harrison Owen's books, through Peggy Holman, through Ann Stadler. I'm hearing your question as, what do we do about getting open space out there? And I hadn't really, I don't know. I don't even know how to engage in that question.
But for me, I have such a hopeful and joyful answer, because it's a great question to be asking. There is a movement called the Open Space. There is an institute. It's on a mission. It believes in the power of open space. But I genuinely believe that since you and I last spoke, Harold or Ryan, which is a couple of months ago, in any depth, just take the UK, there were community halls up and down the country, even families and movements who have never heard of open space, but are in our age, who, if you said, what did you do today? And they said, we just had the most brilliant conversation. You want to read the notes? Sure, like, what do you mean the notes? Well, everybody agreed to write up their conversation. But what happened in the conversations? Well, they came in the morning, and what I decided, I told them, don't bring what you'd normally talk about. So we just had a big blackboard, and we just wrote the spaces that we had and the timings, and then we filled our timetable. And I said, how did it go? They said, well, we're so relaxed. It was so relaxing. If people didn't want to stay in one place, they went somewhere else. And you would hear them describing in detail open space technology. And I think open space has been happening everywhere because it's coming alive in the world. And it's brilliant just that Harrison brought it, but it was still coming up to meet us all. And I believe the Open Space Technology Institute has just as much an important role. but I think there were hundreds of genuine open space events happening all over the world this year.
Boy, that sounds as hopeful a landing as I could imagine for this conversation. Paul, thank you so much for gracing us with the gift of your time and attention, and to everyone out there who's listening to this conversation, whenever and wherever you are. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm humbled to be in the company of two such, yeah, you're the good people of the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And until next time, this has been the Open Space Living Room with Ryan Erickson, myself, Harold Shinsato, and we will see you at the next episode. Thank you so much, Paul, for being present with us.
Bye.